Chris shot me a very brief email a couple of days ago and said, what about doing something or other, blah, blah, blah. It sounded fancy and erudite, but wasn't really very specific.
Thanks, Chris.
Something about, well, then you get what you ask for.
Yes, indeed.
Something about the child as a whole person. So we begin with this image of the child as 100% human, just recognising this, because what other claims might there be if the child were not 100% human? What else could it be? What other components, if it were 95%, hypothetically, what other matter would it be, or other essence would it be? It can only be 100%. The child can only be 100% human. There's no other partial bit. So we have many terms of phrase that sometimes obscure that wholeness of the child, and things like becoming or what it will become. But actually that phrase in itself, as with many ways that we have of understanding the child, simply just tells us something about what it is to be human. If the child is a becoming as well as a being, it's a being and a becoming. That's not just because it's a child. It's because the child is human, and to be human is
to become.
Is to be a being and to be becoming. So already that language that we have about the potentiality of child, the openness of the life of a child, points to something we need to pay attention to in ourselves. Our listening creates a sanctuary for the homeless parts within another person. I'm sure you've experienced that a lot, that your listening creates a sanctuary for the homeless parts within another person. And so in this hour, as we seek to come alongside children and the child as human person, we welcome them here, and we want them to be not homeless amongst us, but present here as we lean into what we might learn. So we're going to spend just a few moments now offering that sanctuary to all children. It's a large task, but we're going to give it a go, and welcome children here into our midst. And to do that, I'm going to invite you just to take a couple of moments to stand up and visit and welcome the children that I've brought in kind of just in 2 dimensions, but they're rich and beautiful photographs of many children from many contexts around the world, and just be present with them, welcome them, and let them speak to you. Let's do this as an exercise of listening, and as you look at the images, listen for what these children speak to you, how they bring something in this time. Perhaps you might think, because in the first hour we've particularly attended to the experience of institutional responses to child sexual abuse, you might want to ask yourself, which of these children do you think might have experienced institutional child abuse, perhaps not just child sexual abuse, other kinds of abuse as well? You might like to think about that, or there might be other things that you attend to. Let's listen. So take some time. Just peruse the gallery. If you'd like to pick up an image, you're very welcome to do that. If you want to pick up an image and take it back to be alongside you, more than one image, you're also welcome to do that. invite you to regather and let's share some of our listening. What is listening to children just in this simple exercise and more broadly? What does that contribute to our sense and perceptions of the nature of being human? What have you heard?
Just struck me about how vulnerable children are and yet how strong they are as well. Like how incredibly strong this baby is to be fighting for its life even when it's so tiny. You know, mine with the definition of spirituality of I will to live and how the little baby's body wills to live even though it's been born premature.
Yeah. When we speak about vulnerability, often it's used as a euphemism for powerlessness, and they're not the same thing. Or weakness, and they're not the same thing either. And one of the major contributions of the child theologian Jensen, not any of the Sydney Anglican Jensens, is in the book Grace to Vulnerability, is aligning the vulnerability of child with God, with the vulnerability of a God. If there's a God that has let all of this be, what kind of risk-taking is that? A God that loves any way that we understand love has a large amount of vulnerability. And so the more that we hear of God being love in any kind of sense, the greater the vulnerability of God. And children point us to that. Someone else?
I chose this this picture because it reminded me of a young boy I knew up in the Kimberley who was 11 and whose parents were unable to care for him, and he was living independently. The local school had given him a job mowing lawns. He went to school, he cared for himself, he lived alone, and he was surviving, and he was becoming, and he was making his way, and I've never really forgotten him. He was incredibly vulnerable, but also incredibly strong. And then I chose this one.
In contrast. Oh.
In contrast, that again, the vulnerability of those children, and the strange thing that this child had more agency than this in what it looks like from the outside at least.
Yes, well, when you think about institutional forms of child abuse, that's got to be, I just got all judgy there, didn't I? I'm unrepentant about that judgment. Their interaction with the institution is fraught, absolutely fraught.
So listen for the strength, listening for the strength.
Yes.
You know, hearing the strength in that, and not turning that child into a victim. No. And listening for the lack of agency in it.
it turns privilege, you know, our sense of privilege on its head, doesn't it?
You wonder who's lonelier.
Would you like to share, James?
I chose this one.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Emma.
that's okay. Yeah, because I feel, you know, a child needs the love of the father and mother, and here both the top is empty. There is nothing coming out of it. So, and also earlier we were talking about institutional concern. So when an abuser abuse, and he try to keep that child silent, and the other side, the family, they also keep quiet. So it's an empty. The child feels so helpless, and so the desperation of the child is very clear. So he feels so sad and so disappointed. So.
Just imagine for a moment that the child, that the human in that picture were not, I don't know, maybe he's 9, 10 perhaps, was 40 or 50. Would that picture be any less desolate?
If we have to see how is his situation when he is 40 or 50. If he's a successful person, he has got a lot of satisfaction with his life. Yes, he succeeded.
This child may well, but if this picture were taken, but instead of being a young lad there, someone your age, James, there, in that same pose with the same, you know, images around it, we would still see the desolation of a human being alone, still as terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Alan, would you like to?
Yeah, my picture is about the mother with 4 children. It can be the siblings almost 1 or 2 years apart, and it can be seems like a situation of homelessness or something that the mother is struggling through. But however, the child is themselves one take care of another. So, but the background of it is that they are surrounded with the blessings. I would say as like they're still, even though they may feel very sad in that situation that they face, but they are surrounded with greenery, with hope. Yeah. So I see that there could be some struggles by the mother, but the child itself don't know that they have been abused in that sense, but they just face it in that way. Yeah, this is my understanding.
We create narratives around the pictures, don't we? You know, you brought a narrative from someone that you have known personally, that was a connection, and here you've created a narrative around what you think might be happening, though we don't actually know, we're guessing. So, you know, our listening is often filled with our own stories as well. How old do you think that mother is?
Very young.
She's young. She is perhaps
20 plus or 30.
Oh, yes, maybe 13, 14. So maybe not the mother of all of those children. Maybe there's a mix there if you kind of do the maths. But there again, it speaks of the liminality between this is a child and then when do we become an adult? And in some cultures, there's a very long spectrum of possibility to mark that, and for others, the mark from the identity of child to adult is, well, there's one day in your life, and we call it today, and it's decided for you by the institution of family, the institution of culture around that.
I actually thought, so it's this one. had to ask Fran what was that, and we decided it was a rat. The first thought was one of optimism. These children learning together, enjoying, looks like little rat babies, so learning about birth and life. But then I had another thought, that's a lot of hands. Big humans and very small creatures, and I'm not sure who's on the rat's side. I don't know if they're safe. And I thought of human trafficking, where there's predators lurking when there's not safety there for defenseless creatures. So the pluses and the minuses.
The story behind that is it's a gerbil. It's not a rat.
It's a gerbil.
It's a gerbil, but that's okay. It's hard to tell because it's deceased, but it was the class pet that was the class gerbil, and it has died, and the class there are gathered in a ritual of remembrance and funeral and whatever needs to be done in that moment of community. So it's children participating in the eventuality of death collectively. Doing that. Chris, did you choose an image or you just?
I've been busy filming, but I
That's
have one in mind.
Just giving you the opportunity.
I have one in mind. I just love this. I'll just show the camera what took my attention. This one. And I think what struck me here was, in a way, the kind of intensity of the child's face, and the way the child's being sort of held up away from everyone else. So you almost want to just focus on this person here. But then my attention was quickly drawn to the expression on the face of the person holding the child, and the expressions on the faces over here. And it struck me that there's this relational connection. I don't know whether these are, the neighbourhood seems to be a fairly basic neighbourhood, whether they're Romani people or I'm not sure. But regardless of how simple or otherwise their context is, where they're living, their homes, for me there's an extraordinary power in the way the relational group here is kind of upholding this beautiful singular manifestation of life, and they're joying in it, they're loving it. That's what I got from it.
One commonality across all of the images, and is a very strong thread for us to listen and pay attention to in who children are, is that all of these images are children in community. None of them are solitary. None of them are solitary. Even where there's only one person in the frame, there's evidence that outside the frame there's community. And even if you can't track that evidence, there's the person that's taken the photo. This child has been found in relationship to another person who has taken this photo. And this essential connectedness that it's impossible to get into human existence in an isolated manner. You cannot do it alone. It's impossible. That absolute barrier defines an element of humanness, connectedness, of relationship that children constantly remind us of. There's one image I'll just point out, which is sad. I think this is the most lonely image in the collection. This one he's very alone. But there is still evidence of human community in conflict, violent community, but nevertheless. And so it's one thing that we hold, that children embody this measure for us of humanness, of connectedness, but we don't over-idealise that. You know, love to think of the child embraced by the father. What image there, Katie? That's beautiful. Or at the mother's breast, or you know, amongst its siblings, its elders held. But that's not the essence of being human with others, which children hold, and they are as part of conflict as anything else. So community is there. Then the diversity of contexts, and how many of the images that you observed had ritual or spiritual elements to them? What did you notice of those ritual and spiritual elements, evidence in children's lives across the images? Maybe not the ones that you chose particularly, but across the whole collection as you survey.
That they're done with others.
It's a collective spirituality.
And that there's outward signs of it, as well as you can see through clothing or resources or whatever, that it is ritual and that there is something formal happening there.
It's embodied, isn't it?
Yeah.
The spiritual, particularly we see evidenced here as we look at a collection of humans, is an embodied.
And in the sense that Alan Niven talks about ritual being part of everyday life, the smallest things that we do in a rhythmic manner together day by day are kind of ritualised expressions of our will to live in that sense. Is beautiful, and you can see that here, you know, doing handstands against the wall, you know, riding your bike, you know.
I love the nuns playing soccer.
The nuns playing soccer and you know, learning and gathering and you know, lighting a fire for food, and they're all ritual activities that express our spirit.
Let's draw our lens back a little bit. As I work with communities that want to embrace their children, want to connect with children more in terms of spiritual care, so churches and schools and prisons and all sorts of contexts, one of the challenges that has emerged in our particular cultural context is the breakdown of conversation between children and elders. That generational divides, we have a whole stack of labels now which are, I don't even like saying the word boomer or Gen X or millennial, because I think they're like racist slurs now, aren't they? The way that people talk about various generations. But those divisions have become kind of calcified, and there are barriers now, perceived barriers, that older people don't know how to speak to the young people of today, and you know, what would I say to them? And so this is actually this is a practical tool that I use to encourage conversations across the whole person and to restore the vision of any person with any other person as you might share and connect, to pick up one of these aspects of personhood that we all share. Which of these categories would be, do you think, the most common way that people think of conversation with children? If they were to have a conversation with a child, what's the first line of topic?
Upbringing?
Tell me about your mum and dad.
Yeah.
Very forward. That's what you usually ask. What did your father do?
Yeah.
Yes, maybe about your family.
Yeah.
Education.
Sorry?
Education.
Education.
So what school do you go to?
What school do you go to? That is always the first question. And let me say, that's, it can start and stop there with your child, can't it?
Age.
It can be, yeah, what age are you? That one's a little bit more open, but education can really just shut down the conversation with children. And there are lots of other things. When was the last time you asked, well, really any human person, so tell me about your experience of your gender. That really will get the conversation going. You can ask me at the end of class if you want to have that conversation.
Or you can come and do the unit on pastoral and spiritual care in the family next year.
Yeah.
I did have a conversation once with a young man who at church who, so it was a younger person who heard what I did for a living, ministry and in the church, and he goes, "Oh, well, you're a woman. How's that been for you? Has that been tough?" Only once has anybody ever asked me that. It was lovely. It's really lovely. So this sense of bringing our whole personhood and seeking to connect across all of that. Again, we ask ourselves, is there a topic there that is not applicable to children? Is there a part of personhood that is not? It's not a way that you could engage with a child. It might not be verbally.
It's interesting because in my tradition, my religious tradition,
Yes.
the faith affirmation
Mhm.
is something traditionally not trusted coming from a child.
Mhm.
So in the interests of pursuing reason as a and freedom of choice as a means of self-identifying as a Christian in my tradition, we've deferred the capacity of the child to affirm their own faith to what we deem to be a rationally self-reflective maturity.
Yeah.
And
And
yeah.
sorry, Chris.
That's right.
But you just said the heretical words, their own faith.
Yeah.
Their
Yeah.
own faith.
Yeah.
I
Right,
presume
yeah,
that
yeah.
at some point you were in a Christian tradition.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we don't believe that in the Christian tradition, do we? It's not your own faith. Whose faith is it? It's the faith of Christ. It's the faith of God that we have, not our own faith. But yes, I know what you're saying. I'm just giving you a little bit of a hard time. But we do press this heresy onto children that they would have their own faith, and we're anxious. We can be anxious about their own faith. Now that's not to control or to deny the creative, imaginative, wondering potential expressions of what a child embraced in the faith of God might look like. That can be very broad, lots of options there.
So
But-
there's spirituality, isn't there, and there's faith. So faith
Yes.
can be a structured thing,
Can be.
and spirituality can be a spiritual thing. But a faith can be an organisation or born into the Christian faith, born into the Jewish tradition, whatever. That's a faith. But spirituality is not.
So we might think of spirituality as a capacity into which faith might interact.
We might, but we wouldn't all.
No.
We wouldn't want to confuse faith with belief, though. And I wonder whether, Fran, you're thinking of belief in a sense of structured set of beliefs.
Or
As-
belonging more so.
Or, or belonging to a community.
Belonging to a certain
Yeah. And where perhaps
kind of
Beth and I
group.
slightly differ theologically. Surprise, surprise, we might have some differences. Is that an understanding of faith, which is actually not that common, by the way, is that faith is the most centred of all central personal acts, in the sense that it is our place of ultimate concern
So spirituality.
So you would probably identify that more closely with spirituality than you would say religious belief or something like that. But yeah, it's an interesting conversation to have, isn't it? What that means.
Yes.
Yeah.
I concur with you, faith is your central concern,
Yeah.
but in that conversation of faith affirmation,
Yeah, right.
it's not
Yeah.
about is your central concern your
Yeah.
most strongest core
Mm.
resonance. It's are you resonating with what we want you to resonate
Right,
with?
exactly. That's usually where the anxiety lies. Yeah,
That's
right.
exactly
Yeah.
exactly right.
Yeah.
Let's move along to a bit of a case study. So forgive me for taking the Christian scriptures as a case study here, but it's good to pummel, I find. This is the work of a child theologian, Marcia Bunge. She's a Lutheran from the United States, but she has a German heritage, that's the Lutheran. And she looking for materials for a theology of child and how children participate in theological thought, not how children do theological thought, but what their place is. She surveyed vast amounts of the Christian scriptures, both the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Testament, for images of the child, and asked this question: how are children placed within the narratives of faith, within the narratives of the stories of people seeking, finding, abandoning God? So she came up with these 6 different categories. And this is really important because as we've kind of worked with these in different communities, we've realised that many communities have kind of a favoured 1 or 2 of these images for who children are in their spiritual presence in our communities, where they fit in our narratives of human spirituality. And she says no, there's not just 1, there's not just 2, here are 6, and she also leaves it open and says, I've probably missed a lot, so if you find more, very, very good. But let's at least look at these 6 as case studies. So the first thing she says is there's a whole stack of material in which children are models of faith and lights of revelation in the narrative. That is their spiritual experience, their spiritual contribution, their spiritual expression in the life of community. So I don't know if any texts come to mind for you, if you have knowledge of the Christian scriptures where children express a revelation that adults perhaps have missed.
I think of the story of like Samuel hearing from God, and that the adults around him missed that message, but Samuel was there and able to listen to God.
So there's a story of young Samuel. He's living in the institution, so much as it existed, of the place of faith in the community, and there's absolute corruption through the adult leadership of that place, intergenerational corruption between Eli the priest and then his sons. Involves the exploitation of women, the sexual exploitation of women, and it's the child Samuel who is given this word to speak out against the corruption and switch the lights on and expose that corruption institutionally. There's an example of what she means. And there are lots of others.
The one that immediately springs to my mind is the child that must have been terrified that Jesus took and placed at the centre of this gathering of rather ignorant men, and said, well, unless you can become more like this, you haven't got it. That strikes me as extraordinary, because the child, just by virtue of its being, was revelatory.
Correct. Yeah. That's right, not spoken revelation. So there we have, that's confronting too, because the child just by its being redefines what revelation might mean to some very word-centered communities. Okay, so as well as this kind of revealing, modelling, contributing wisdom, if we go down to the bottom left hand, we have children are developing beings in need of instruction. So as well as contributing wisdom, they are recipients. Now, this is the model of child that has taken over not just Christendom, but also Western culture. Right? You ask, what do children need? They need moral education. They need to be taught to be good girls and boys. They need instruction. They need Christian instruction or spiritual instruction. Maybe they need general religious instruction. But and that must be done in age-appropriate ways, in stages, because they're developing beings. This is such a strong narrative for us. We almost don't notice it. It's the wallpaper that's been there all along. However, it does occur a little bit, in the Christian scriptures. We point to an example.
Deuteronomy is where it talks about teaching and instructing children.
Right. So that's a beautiful one, because the way in which that's meant to happen is very embodied, isn't it? It's very everyday. It's clearly not in a school, and it's not. It's really not developmental either. It's in eating and rising and walking and lying down, things that you do regardless of age. So it sort of cuts across the developmental frame of child.
So in a way, it's like impressing the teaching, the instruction into their head.
We need to have a caution here. The book of Proverbs often comes up as a narrative here, and we just need to be careful, because the book of Proverbs is not actually a childhood text. Every time it says my son, my child, those terms, they don't relate to what we would think of as children. This was the book of Proverbs is the textbook of the young elite academy, 17, 18-year-old elite men of the Hellenized Jewish community trying to assimilate and get along. And we can sort of tell that, because why would you have a book for 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds that tells them not to commit adultery and to beware of the woman who says, come into my door, and what to do with their money? It doesn't make sense if you try and read Proverbs for children, but people then do, especially the bit with the stick. I think there are a few 18-year-olds that probably.
What's the actual quote, Beth, for those of us who are not familiar with it?
Oh.
Spare the rod, spoil the child. I mean, isn't
Well,
the way
no,
it's
that's not
been
even in
paraphrased?
yes.
Yeah.
Discipline the child
Yeah.
with the rod.
Mm.
Okay. Fully human and bearers of the Imago Dei, the image of God. This idea that children are fully human. There's no partiality about their fractional humanity. Any humanity is all humanity. And that we bear the image of God. We need to connect that up with the idea that children reveal to us humanness as being in relationship. So it stops us from looking at an individual child and saying, do they bear the image of God individually, just as it prevents us from looking at an adult human and saying, do they bear the image of God? The answer is no, of course not. Only as we're in relationship, that is how the image of God in the text. Okay? So taking our case studies from Genesis, male and female and created. We've got other, we've got connection, we've got relationship. When my oldest son was about 6, we were lying in bed one night, trying to get him to go to sleep. And he, into the darkness, he says, Mum, when God created Adam and Eve, did he make them as children, as babies, like everyone else? Or did he make them as grown-ups? Because, Mum, that seems really unfair if he didn't make them as children. Because why would God be that mean not to let them be kids? Here's a 6-year-old's perspective on what the creator should do.
Whoops.
I love that kind of hubris.
Yeah.
It's just the right kind of question though, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I say, well, and then he goes on to say, because in all the storybooks, it looks like they're grown-ups, but God wouldn't be that mean. So he's trying to put together his terrible, Bible storybooks image with what he hears in the text, and he's got a dissonance there about what it means to be human as a 6-year-old. So I do the good mothering thing and say, well, when we're not sure about something, it's really good to go back to the text and read it again. So we switch on the light, we get out the Bible, we read the end of Genesis 1 and into Genesis 2, and listening out for clues and hints, put on our sleuth hats. And at the end, I go, well, what do you think, Tim? And Tim says, I can't tell. And I go, yeah, neither can I. It really could be either. And he says, well, what do we do? And I go, well, I think you should pray. You can talk to God about this and ask. And if this is, God has good ways of letting us know. If it's something we really need to know, he has a way of letting us know. And if it's not something that we need to know, he has a way of letting us let go, right? So switch off the light, snuggle back into bed. And so in the dark, he says, so Mum, I should talk to God about it. And I said, yeah, that'd be great, Tim. And he said, oh good, because that's the main way I know of praying, that and dancing. This question of bearing the image of God in relationship together fully as children, and it presses into that text, doesn't it? We need to dance that question to the cosmos and ask, what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to bear the image of God? Can we imagine first humans, I'm not saying historically first humans, I mean the most essence of humanness in the mind of God or in the seed of the cosmos, or however you want to say that, being child, can we hold that? Bearing the image of God, that's a high and mighty kind of a thing, perhaps. That is contrasted with texts that speak of bearing sinful nature and children being moral agents. As we look across our images in the gallery, and as we read parts of our Christian scriptures, our Hebrew Bible, children are part of moral life. It's inescapable. And they are not only victims in it. There's much that they're victims of, but not only victims. It's hard for us to hold this, but as Chris said earlier, we understand ourselves as being part of systems that are destructive just by our living. And our children too are part of those same systems. And we read lots of those examples as well. Alongside those images we have children as gifts from the hand of God. That's about their coming from somewhere that is beyond our control. Yeah, we're very, very heavily tilted in our culture towards children being something that we control when they arrive, when they don't arrive, what happens to them once they arrive, and them being ours. So, for example, many people say about my sister, she's 40 and she doesn't have any children, possess any children. She doesn't have a house either. I'm 50, I have children. Like a possession, is this how we speak of children? Well, these texts that speak of them as gifts from the hand of God pull away our moorings, our claims that children are ours. One of the ways that we might think of this and speak better is to not say that children belong to us, but belong with us. So that we can still affirm belonging and community. I'm not abandoning my children just because I've discovered that they're not mine to hold and keep and have as possessions, but their humanity says they belong with, in connection, alongside, but not to me, nor do I belong to them as their mother.
There are some beautiful Australian Indigenous spirituality narratives that kind of correlate nicely with that. And I don't know if you've seen the film 10 Canoes, great film, and the whole story is undergirded by this sense that the narrator is a fish waiting in this place of water to be born. And then when he ultimately dies, he goes back to this place of water and waits to be born again another time. Connects the whole sense of life and existence to an ongoing rhythm of natural process and giftedness from the earth to humanness. Similar in some ways.
Then to kind of mitigate, balance perhaps, that is that children are the neediest of the marginalised. When things go really seriously wrong in the narratives, when injustice is most rampant, children bear the brunt of that most. And this is not to speak of the inferiority of children, but that there's a responsibility. They are gifts from the hand of God in the text. They're not ours to possess and do whatever we want with, but there is responsibility. So there's two kind of interwoven sets of narratives prevent us from abusing children through possession, just treating them as instrumentally as our objects, and they also prevent us or constrain us from abusing them by neglecting them, by not seeing that we have responsibility to them. Can you think of an example of where injustice is most rampant, need is greatest, and children bear the hardest edge of that?
War. When there's war, a lot of orphans.
Both today and in the text. In the siege of Jerusalem, what is it, 2 Kings 6, everyone's starving, and there's 2 women come before the king, and woman number 1 says, bring me justice. This woman and I came to an agreement that tonight, last night we would cook and eat her child, with the agreement that tonight we would cook and eat my child, and we sorry, the other way around, in my child and then put her child. I gave my child and we ate the child, and now she won't give hers to the same process. Bring justice to that. It's devastating. What is justice in that? What is justice in that situation? So these narratives that come from a rich tradition of scripture, these perhaps play in our lives, even if they are not our own, even if we haven't been part of particularly part of church communities that rehearse these. Much of Christendom has picked up various ones of these and rehearse it during the recent campaigns in regard to the non-binding, non-compulsory postal survey on same-sex marriage. Some of these were rehearsed as if everyone agreed. So they speak over us, speak over our children.
So, because I'm totally out of my depth here,
Mm-hmm.
the worldviews are beyond my capacity to contribute, really. What I'm understanding is that you're saying these are understandings that various institutions, Christian institutions, are finding in the Bible and basing doctrine on. You're not necessarily agreeing with it.
No.
Okay.
Well, it's hard to agree with it all, isn't it, when there are contrasts? If we want to have just one view of who children are.
That was a question of understanding this discussion.
Yeah, that's right. That it's how can these overlap and interweave, and then the next question is, these have been prevalent in Christendom, in Christian cultured communities, but of course now we have lots of other narratives and discourses of who children are in their personhood as humans. I think what to take from this is to see how, as a case study, this one set of texts negotiates balances and conversation about children, and therefore about personhood and humanness across these different sort of sets of tensions. So between being both models of faith, which is positive, and yet bearers of sinfulness, or moral struggle, that they sit in tension with one another across the text.
To what extent, sorry,
Yeah,
Beth,
go.
but to what extent can we ask the question of how these narratives that are inherent to so much of our cultural perspective might actually place us at risk of abusing children? Are we able to ask those sorts of questions of the text?
We certainly are. So Marsha's, this is a case study of handling the text and interrogating it for this question of who are children in this particular spiritual framework. And so first of all, she would say, where you cling fervently to one, myopically to one, and neglect others, you're in danger. That's the first thing, and we certainly have that witness within our institutions that have been identified as institutions where child abuse has been at its worst. Religious education institutions have been extremely problematic, haven't they? Yep. Religious education, because their children are developing beings in need of instruction, and the rest of their capacity, for example, to have a prophetic voice against adult life, wider life, to bear before you, if before you is and between you and the child is an image-bearing, a God image-bearing relationship, how can you abuse that? You know,
Yeah.
Not being your possession to do with as you want, being a gift from the hand of God. So overemphasis on one of these leads to vulnerabilities of moral
Or, yeah,
negligence.
to all of them.
Sorry?
To all of them.
Yes, any one of them.
Mm.
Any one of them. Mm.
Because any one of those, if seen as central or even important enough, removes the agency of the child.
Yes. So even, you know, the
All
neediest
of
of the marginalised, sorry, did you-
Removes the
Mm.
capacity for the child to be strong.
That's right. So that's, I mean, child-centred aid agencies like compassion or World Vision, yeah, where they child sponsorship have a very difficult task of negotiating the ethics of, well, we really want to help this child. They are the most needy, so surely they're most worthy of our need and aid and care. But in order to do that, what do? We destroy family relationships, we remove them from community, we put them then into educational institutions, religious education institutions, where they're more vulnerable to abuse. So exactly, that's any one of them.
And if you're making them the model of faith in light of revelation, you're giving them a hell of a lot of responsibility.
Yeah, that's right. And I think what I'm picking up too in this fantastic conversation is that if we focus too much on one or the other, what we're actually doing is skewing our own perspective
Meeting their
of
needs,
another
actually.
person who we've already described as complex and fully present as a human person, as a child, holding all of what it means to be human. So it's actually our own perspective that can be skewed, and that's one of the core risks in abuse is the way we perceive the other
Yes.
to be.
Yes.
And the question then, Chris, if you were to be skewed in how you're defining and perceiving the human personhood of the child, of the other, who are you then being?
Yes.
So, for
Yes.
example, where you see them as developing being, or let's try the bearer of sinful nature. This is a wicked child anyway, so any moral wrong that I do to it is inconsequential because they're a wicked child anyway. That view. That's who the child is. Who does that then make me? I'm beyond. I'm the bearer of God to them. You can see how a distortion of the personhood of the child leads to a distortion of the personhood, spiritual personhood.
And how can the child succeed if they are doomed from the beginning and told so?
Created sick and commanded to be well.
Oh, where did you get that from? I haven't heard that one. I should be finishing. Let me offer some invitations to you. We've listened to the child. We must also listen to ourselves as to what, perhaps we didn't grow up in this tradition. What narratives are we carrying ourselves? And to be welcoming to that. Who were you as a child? To listen into that. When were you powerful and when were you vulnerable? And how do you understand your spirituality as a child in relation to those questions? So how do you sense that as a child when you were powerful, what was that spiritually for you? And when you were vulnerable, what was that spiritually? So another way perhaps of asking that question for myself is, when I was powerful as a child, where was God? Who was God in that? And when I was vulnerable as a child, as a sexually abused child? Where was God in that? So that's about writing our own, listening for ourselves and then colouring in and writing our own narratives well. We've covered a lot of ground. Much of this has pointed to the politicisation of the child, even as we're trying to lean into understanding the child as a whole person. We're doing that from a spiritual care perspective. We've tipped over into politics a number of times. The kinds of things that we hear, children should be raised by their biological parents, one mum and one dad. The key to a child's flourishing is educational opportunity. Oh no, shock horror, our children are exposed to exploitative porn on the internet. These are things that are said. Children need age-appropriate modifications in their daily life activities. The Royal Commission means that we need to ramp up our policies on protective behaviours for working with children. My sister's been married for 10 years and doesn't have any kids. These are kind of commonplace sorts of opinions that are often expressed in public discourse about what needs to be done about children. And you can see how each of these actually pulls against those affirmations of who children are as whole beings. We don't have time to explore all of those. This is a complex activity, but it's one that it's probably one to do when you have a case study or a particular example in front of you and you're looking for how is this child's personhood, whole personhood, being abused or misshapen in the way they've been treated or the situation that they're in order to kind of restore opportunities of spiritual care to them. And that is that these represent sort of continua of categories or questions around who children are. So every child is different, there's a diversity of context, and there's no such thing as a common childhood, and I mean the other end of the spectrum is all children are the same, children are children, genericism, either end of that spectrum, and we tend to lose sight of the child as a whole person. Children are 100% innocent, they're just, precious blank slates, they're pure and unassailed. Or down the other end, children are completely depraved, they're born into a world that's off its axis and unhinged, and they are too, right from the get-go. You can see that, as the theologian Augustine would say, they're just, you can see it in their selfishness. They want to be fed. And on we go. Continuity and discontinuity. Is there continuity or discontinuity between being a child and being an adult? Are you still the same person between being a child and being an adult? Or is there a sense of putting off some parts of childhood or even all of childhood and becoming, you can hear this, we have quotes in our heads of that perhaps, some of us. Are we an individual? Are all children just bereft and on their own, completely individualised, and to be treated in that way? Or are they subsumed into the family and we can only access children via their place in the family? Do children have a limited cognition? They can't think for themselves, so don't engage that. Or do we over-exaggerate? Well, the thing we have to do is focus on cognition. We've got to get their brains going so then they can actually be a real human. I'm exaggerating that. Children, are they burdens or are they trophies? Are children natural? In essence, they bring content with them into the world, or are they crafted from something else? Are they incapable, lacking in capacity, can't do anything? hyper vulnerability, I guess that is, or are they troublemakers? You know, the old, a father is a man who has photos in his wallet where his money used to be. That children are trouble, they're problems. Are they vulnerable and easily manipulated, or are they demanding, defiant and unyielding? These are exaggerations. As we think about the way that children's stories are told and the responses to institutional child abuse, one of the common responses is of overprotection. What we need to do is protect children more. We need to put boundaries and fences around them more and more. Do things to them, do around them. The report, the recommendations, actually says the opposite. It says children must be agents. They must be voices. They must have prophetic voices back to us. We must let them be troublemakers. We must let them be defiant in the face of what has happened and may happen again. I'll leave this material with Chris to upload, or I'll upload it myself. There we go. I could do that. So I didn't see Beth. Here are some questions in particular regarding what we've covered about the child as a whole person in relation to institutions. So how does the experience of institution differ for a child from that as an adult? Are there any differences? In what ways does the constraint of children in institutional context contribute to the dehumanisation of institutions and its other participants? So when we subjugate children in institutions and dehumanise them in any way, does that not actually create the dehumanisation of the institutions themselves? Are the parts of institutions that interface with children particularly prone to becoming sites of abuses of power? Is there a particular vulnerability there? And if so, why? Why would it be just children? Or is the case of children, which we've given some careful attention to, just part of a much broader picture of abuse? And looking at children really is helpful to us in understanding how institutions abuse all of us, potentially, or other ones of us. Not get stuck on the age there. And in what ways is a child a powerful agent in our institutions? Because they are. A school with no children, not a school. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Beth.
Oh,
Spiders.
yes, this is just a witness to little things are complicated things, are complex things. Little things are not simple things. I'm done.
Thank you, Beth.
Sorry about that.
No, not at all.